Welcome to Humans of Techlandia. This March, Tao's People and Culture team is taking over the pod to explore the human side of rapid tech change. Each week, we're talking to Oregon-grown leaders about what they're seeing and what it means for the rest of us. Today's guest is Amber Case. Case studies the interaction between humans and technology and how those interactions shape culture. Case is the author of Calm Technology and a leading voice in designing tech that supports human attention and well-being. Today, we're going to explore how our relationship with technology is evolving and what it means to design for calm in a world of constant input, and how we can stay grounded as change accelerates. Case, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So I want to start at the beginning. What was the genesis of your particular interest in calm technology?
Sure. Well, I was an undergrad in anthropology and sociology at Lewis and Clark College, which is in Portland, Oregon, and I was writing my thesis on cyborg anthropology, which is a subsection of the anthropology of science. It's all about humans and technology and how technology affects culture. And I was really interested right when the iPhone came out in 2007, how that flat screen would affect us, how we thought. And I decided to walk around San Francisco, where there were a lot of early adopters, and see how behavior was changing. And one of the little vignettes that I that I wrote was, "Put that dog on hold." It was people walking up Bernal Hill and putting their dog on hold so that they could touch the screen. Because unlike with a BlackBerry, where you didn't have to look as much with the physical buttons, you had to look entirely to touch the buttons and type on the screen and look at something. So I was actually looking at the behavior change in humans through the lens of a dog because the dog had never experienced this before. It was like, "Er, like, what are you doing? Like, what is this thing you're looking at that seems to have an infinity of things, but the dog is not really understanding what's going on." And this became very interesting to me because I thought, okay, I want to contextualize this into something larger. And the most important thing I thought of was in all subjects, whether it's international security or law or medicine or especially civil engineering, you study a bit of the history of the subject before you practice it. Ideally, you get some historical notion. For instance, if you're doing international studies with a security focus, you're going to study the Peloponnesian War as if it was yesterday, because it is a thing that doesn't change. Humans are very similar in the same way that we can read a play from 2,000 years ago and perform it on stage and have it be fundamentally interesting to everyone in the audience, whereas we look at a computer from 1980 and it's not something that we use every day. So what's the difference? If we have a set of human universals, the belongingness and safety, the need to drink water, these basic things, food oriented, do we have technology universals that don't change even as the shape of technology changes? What is it really? And so I sought to find original work that it didn't matter what era it was written in, but it would read just like today. So I found Mark Weiser and John Seeley Brown's work called Calm Technology. Starting in about 1993, they were writing about the world is not a desktop computer. We can't interact with the world as it is one. And even the Macy meetings, which was anthropologists and cyberneticists in the 1940s in England, they were talking about what happens when something gets so small, a piece of computing technology gets so small. Then, these people were talking about the scarce thing is no longer technology. Technology becomes cheap, but the scarcest thing becomes attention. And how technology works with or against attention will make or break the future of technology. And there were these incredible little research papers that had a few principles in them. And I cried when I read, the world's not a desktop or, the computer for the 21st century or any of these articles because they read just like today. They seem so contemporary, like reading a Greek play. And I was wondering, well, what happened to these people? And I kind of waited a long time thinking, Mark Weiser, who was really the push against this. He was at Xerox PARC. He was really fascinating human being. He was really the counterpoint to Nicholas Negroponte's, from MIT Media Lab's notion that, we should really kind of move fast and break things, which was it's the idea that we might have all this new tech on our homes, but we have a trusted coffee maker, or we have light switches that we don't need to replace because they'll last for 100 years. It's both of them are technologies. A pair of running shoes is a technology, a cane, a pair of glasses. But one of them is so well built that is unnoticeable. It's a pass-through technology. And so we don't think about it anymore. We don't think about the chair that we're sitting in, if it's well done, or the desk we're sitting at, but we do notice Zoom because and it's not humans being bad at technology, it's technology being bad at humans. And so I waited around for a book to be written about calm technology, and then I learned that Mark Weiser died when he was 46. And then I later learned that he had taken off time from Xerox PARC to go back up to upstate New York to work on the book, and he died before he could really do much. And it was a real tragedy because the dominant narrative in the world became move fast and break things, make things really big. And then, when the blue LED came out, it became what was formerly very expensive to produce. The color of the future became blue and in your face, and it looked more like science fiction, which is not a good roommate. It's supposed to be on the screen and stimulating versus things that would work alongside us, like a light switch or even a toilet or a sink or, the early killer apps for electricity being the laundry machine, the stove, like all of these things. Our next generation of technology is trying to be more mental than those physical extensions of self. So I expanded those principles of calm technology that I saw the beginnings of into 8 principles, and I worked on a book. And after that book came out in 2015, I went on tour with it for 5 years until COVID, and people started asking, they said, "These principles are pretty interesting. I'll give you a couple of them. Technology should require the smallest amount of attention. Technology should inform and create calm. Technology should make use of your peripheral attention. When you're driving a car, your focus is on the road. Everything else in your secondary attention, glance ability, looking in your blind spot, these are all to support your primary attention. And while we can mechanically, physically multitask, you can have a foot pedal, you can have your hand on the steering shifter, you can be turning the radio dial and rolling down the window while driving and talking to the person next to you and listening to the radio. We cannot really mentally multitask in the same way. So the minute
Mhm.
we put a phone on the dash and we try to tap something, it's a big issue. So, and the final, one of the other things is like technology should amplify the best of what technology can do and what the best of humanity can do. And so a lot of people said that's great. There were these big brands that said principles are nice, but how do you measure this? And so we released this Calm Tech certified program, which is an 81-point scorecard, how much attention technology takes. And it's the very first one in the world that rates human attention and gives a score. So we look at primary attention, peripheral attention, durability. Does it work when it fails or does it turn into e-waste? The light, is it a bright blue light or is it nice orange light? Does it shout at you? Sound. Does it sound like a microwave? And then materials. What's it made of? Is it going to be terrible to use or touch? Are there raised dots on the buttons so that you can see them with your hands instead of just your eyes? And so a lot of it is kind of a misnomer. A calm room or piece of calm tech isn't something that looks like a yoga ball in a blank room. It's actually that our minds don't like flatness and our fingertips don't like flatness is actually more information in a space designed well, like a forest, is stimulating our minds. And without that expected stimulation of physical buttons and like knobs and ridges and all these things, our brains are stuck in this kind of sensory deprivation. And it leads us to be anxious because we kept expecting input, kind of like trying to still use your phone when you're on the airplane. Your phone drains battery really fast because it's trying to connect to all these different cell towers, but it doesn't have enough. And
Yeah.
so, really, the philosophy behind what I've been trying to do with Calm Tech Institute and Calm Technology.
I had this experience. It's interesting that you said that you were going on a tour all the way up until COVID. I had this experience during the year that COVID was going on. And that was such a year of like incredible input through our phones, right? So much of our life was happening through technology. For the first time, I think, for a lot of people. And there weren't these kind of regular low stakes interactions that we would have normally had from day to day. Everything was very high stakes, it felt like. I had this experience case where I was in my kitchen and my phone kept beeping, and it was like 3 phenomena. I think we were planning a camping trip, there was George Floyd protests happening, and there was some probably other thing that was, like, on a 3rd level. And I remember walking to the kitchen, walking to the refrigerator, walking back to the counter, like, 4 times, just not even being able to remember what I was going to the refrigerator for. And so I think what I had imagined when I was going to set up this interview with you is that we were going to be talking about how do we stay calm, kind of like in this Zen place. But it's a different thing altogether. It's really about owning our own minds, right? The ability to own our sense of self and our possession of of who we are as humans in relationship to technology. And when I read your book, those are the things that really jumped out at me around these principles. I'm kind of curious, as we've kind of moved forward in time from COVID and from having these larger discussions about like screen addiction and burnout and things like that into an even more ubiquity of technology. Which of the particular elements of calm technology feel most relevant to the work you're doing with technologists today?
Yeah, good question. I feel like I try to look at time as all time, so,
Great.
and then, so for instance, like, 100 years ago would be, like, the '80s, and then, like, the 1600s would be, like, the '50s, Like, it's just I was in a museum of anthropology at, UBC campus in, Vancouver, BC, and it was really funny. Here's this whole collection of baskets in perfect working order from 4,000 years ago. No problem, they look brand new. I mean, I know that some of them have been restored, but they're very robust, and they're made from natural materials, and right next to it was a an iMac sitting there, and it was like, "Sorry, this computer is down due to technical difficulties." That the baskets, that we like to make fun of, underwater basket weaving, and this is like, well, actually, this is going to last for a really long time, and also the process of doing it is a calm technology because your fingertips are getting all sorts of information and stimulus. I think the biggest thing that I've been realizing lately is not necessarily the term friction, but the term texture and the neuroscience of how our brains input information. That we have, basically to slim it down, our back brains, our sense of touch is the earliest one, like the earliest sense. That's what we have. That's what we have as a baby. That's what we have in the womb. And that when you have no other senses, like no hearing, no vision, you still have touch. And it's it's very efficient because it's been around so long in the brain, and that the ocular sense that you're looking at with your eyes is a huge part of, we have this huge frontal cortex development that makes it hard to, birth children. um, and we decided to stand upright, and so we had our hands free for tools, but it's still really about touch. The issue is that our society has turned from more touch. If you look at what people touch in their everyday lives now versus 20 years ago, it's a phone, it's flat surfaces, and so we're touching more with our eyes than we are with our hands. And
Mhm.
it's been shown now that handwriting, you can write 5 times less in terms of notes if you write by hand, because every letter has a specific distinct shape, and that triggers our brain's memory differently from every key being the same shape. So I've been doing a little bit of work with Lenovo with a ThinkPad because they've actually worked with the School of the Blind to provide like raised bumps on some of the keys so that you can figure them out by touch and really orient yourself. But that works for everybody. So I think the big thing was that if we are understimulated with our hands, we're not making things anymore except for food. If we're lucky, mostly we're tapping on our phones to get it delivered. We're losing all of that natural cortisol reducing stimulation in the back brain through touch. And we're getting super highly anxious by looking at stuff that's really far away from us, that's unending. And when we have less of that touch, we go to our phone and we say, I want that information again. And it's just this hollow substitution. And so we go more and more into it to get rid of our sensory deprivation, and we end up getting even more sensory deprived. And so that's an interesting thing. I think, back to dogs. I was thinking, why do you take your dog on a walk in the morning? And the dog wants to know all the social media status updates of all the other dogs by their scent, right? It's running around the block. Ooh, what's new? What's new? What's new? What's new? Basically reading the local paper. And that's what we used to do, not necessarily by smell, but seeing the state of things. And once we were done walking around, we could act, we could make a plan. But when we're exposed to an environment in which the information is endless and we have no control over things, and a lot of it is marketed to twist our brain and to produce more cortisol, and then, give us a video of ideally cortisol reduction for puppies, and then back and forth and back and forth. We're in this mental whiplash that's happening in our brains, and the way to do it is to say, actually, is it useful to be on Instagram? If you have a really good local network, you don't need Instagram. But what about people that make their money off of Instagram? I've been finding little niche communities that do not need Instagram to make a living. And it's a lot of older people with a website from, like, 2004 that doesn't really need to be updated. It's, static HTML, so it doesn't cost very much money, and they just put their products and they say, "Here's my phone number, call me if you wanna buy them."
Yeah,
Like, I
it is a wild thing. My daughter's interested in the Rotary International program, and Rotary is a very old program, and we're about to fill out a form for something that is an analog form with pen and paper, that we're filling out, and there's something about that too, which and there's another analogy I wanna bring in here, but what the analogy about the pen and paper form is that is something that she and I can do together on a table, and
Right.
she can actually participate in.
Yes.
Whereas if so many of the things that I've done for my kids, they've been omitted from because they happen on a device that's too small to share,
Yep.
which is the phone, right? So if I'm filling out camp applications, things like that, they're really unaware of the amount of administrative work I do on their behalf. So that's one awareness I had, as we're talking about that. The other one that I'm thinking about in terms of search, there is this very satisfying experience of reaching for and finding the thing that you're looking for, right? Like I was on a plane yesterday and reaching into your bag and finding the lip gloss you need or finding the pen that works really well. And it's almost like in Instagram, it's like the contents of everyone else's purse in the entire world is inside your purse as you're reaching for it, right? And there's somebody else who's trying to get you to buy a new pen or buy a new lip gloss at the same time. So, yeah, I'm just kind of expand on what are our rights? What should we be expecting from these companies who are designing that we're not getting?
Yeah, well, it reminds me of first, I really loved your analogy about, the joy of reaching into a handbag and finding something, which we find based on touch.
Which they
So,
find based on touch, right? Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of the luxury brands, like, I have some lip gloss that it has a specific shape, and I buy it because of the shape, because I can find it with my hands. And it's great, but I think these companies don't owe us anything because we pay to use them via clicking on ads. They're never going to owe us anything, and it does remind me when there was, like, I don't think it was a World's Fair, but it was kind of like a retail show that a bunch of Americans went to in France in I think the '30s, and they came back and they said, "Oh my gosh, plate glass windows and storefronts and the Main Street design." And what it meant was, for the first time, is that people could walk down the street and see. I mean, window shopping was kind of always a thing, but it was even more intense to be able to look through a plate glass window and be in the store while being on the street without having to go into the store. And there was this terror at that time that people just couldn't help it. There were these stories about a guy coming home and his wife has spent all this money, and he says he'd say, "Actually, I don't need to pay this," because she couldn't help herself. And in a sense, none of us really can. The cognitive neuroscience of how we react to things is very well studied by advertising. They've had many unbroken years to understand, and advertising used to be called propaganda. I mean, it's and it's people going to art school to just study art history to wield that into the shape that has us react to things as if our brains are reacting to art.
I saw a quote one time that said, "Advertising, it helps me decide." And I
Nice.
was I just really was that is thank
See,
you. That's a very good summary.
people yeah. I did work at Wieden Kennedy for a while because in my anthropology class, we got to study the science of science, and if you did really well in the class, we were promised an internship at Wieden Kennedy. Now, that internship program was over by the time I took the class, and I said, "I've gotta get myself to Wieden Kennedy. I need to know the other side of the story." And it was really helpful because it's interesting. If you're doing something, there's a fair amount of marketing and there's a fair amount of word of mouth, but to get people to buy things they don't need, especially during the depression, it was you're not getting a job not because of the depression, but because your teeth might not be so clean. Here's a toothpaste, right? It's like preying on the insecurities. But I think that today, especially Instagram, it is a huge plate glass main street shop that is impossible to look away from, almost like a Roman stadium where you cannot look away. And there's this article called "A Generation Lost in the Bazaar," We can't get
Mhm.
away because the bazaar is no longer in the shopping malls in which there was some sort of social interaction, real social interaction. And it was cool to go to the mall when Victor Gruen, an Austrian, architect, invented the mall and nobody would allow it. But then I think in 1967 in Minnesota was like, "A mall? That sounds great. You mean it can be temperature controlled inside and people can walk around in a balmy 73 degrees or whatever?" They started this first mall in Edina, Minnesota, and then it became cool to go to the mall. It was an architectural panacea that created that strolling down the main street in Austria, in Vienna, I believe. And so, really, all of this is about architecture history and kind of ocular history. When we are devoid of our bodies and we just go into our eyes, we shift entirely into that frontal cortex, and it's extremely expensive to run. We feel exhausted. It's just like that paperwork that you got to do with your kid, is that when it's physically on a piece of paper and you're writing physically, you're going to remember the experience more. And those clubs, Rotary Club and so many different clubs that have existed for a long time, they don't need digital technology to work. They can work on fax machines, and then some of them still do. They can work on, it's actually the more analog that they are, or like, Presbyterian church with volunteers, is that these are the things that people come to revive their souls, to feel good. And a lot of it is because, you know, they look quaint, but they're actually incredibly sophisticated. And I would say, here's an old organization is not necessarily that it's old, it's that it's stable and that anybody can really join it and the bad actors are kind of removed. Whereas you have all these things, moderation on Discord and Slack and this and the social network. And it's like, well, yeah, it's kind of like these old bad forums in the past that, you even had more because you had a small community of like, your music fans, you could moderate because it was in batches of like 1,000. And now when you have one whole conversation in the Colosseum of thought, you don't really get to do that. It's a, one size fits all. Whereas Rotary clubs and all these other chapters, like they have individual chapters. They work a little bit more like Greek city states, which is like you kind of swap around. Even Toastmasters, which I did for a while, it's like a speaking club. You rotate your job every time you go through. So each time you're at a Toastmasters meeting, you're either the joke master and bring a joke, or you're the counter, or you're the timer, or you're the presenter. And so you get to experience what it's like to be each of them so that you have more compassion for the people in the club and you all grow together, much like kids playing on a playground. And there's different flavors of it, right? So you could go to the one at 6 a.m. in Cherry Creek in Denver, Colorado, where you're probably going to meet a politician before they go to work after they've taken their like morning jog. Or you're going to meet one that's like 7 p.m. and it's going to be a different flavor. But the idea is that there's chapters and flavors, kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous or any of these groups. And they're incredibly a bit rhizomatic, kind of like a tree system. And maybe a little bit like Darwin's finches, but the quality control is set by the bylaws and the governance, and it's also fun to participate in. The miniatures community that I'm studying is so much fun because it's a lot of retirees who are from incredibly sophisticated high-tech careers, and they're excited about 3D printing and things, but one of the big things for the international guild of miniature artists is like a lobster dinner, and it's very doofy, and everybody like takes doofy photo like, it's silly, kind of like fraternities and sororities. And I think one of the things about moderation and governance is that it has to be fun, and there has to be this, like, long time thing, and so many of these things that, are almost a two-dimensional, patina. It's almost like, the kind of fake Victorian, that it's really decorative in the front and the back, it's like a clown show, and, like a carnival ride. And I think that's the thing is that a lot of people are upset now because they'd never even got to experience what it was to be at a 4-H club or a Rotary club or anything. And we call those people traditional and old-fashioned, but in fact, they are not. It's about time not being a thing. And so any sort of physical hobby that's unmediated by a huge corporation, but by like a small group is going to be really helpful. It's really important, you can have if you have like an activist group, they'll get super exhausted and it won't be fun. And then they're easy to tear apart by external politics. And like there's been a lot of practice at like seeding discontent and like destabilizing a group. Like you can't do that with Rotary Club. So it's really hard.
And I think it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this in technology is just such a wide word, and I really do love the ways that talking to you, Case, like I get this expanded lens, not just on time, but even the meaning of what technology is, because there are technologies of how we group and how we meet together. As a facilitator, that's something that I think about a lot. And it is interesting, like, if you could imagine, everybody gets to be a chance to be the influencer. It's not a part of, like, the number of followers you have, it's a role that someone plays in a group for a temporary period of time, because everybody should have access to playing that role. That's kind of when you're in these kinds of groups in the past and you would rotate responsibilities, you would get to rotate those experiences. And I think now it feels like sometimes the pathway to feeling significance is being able to navigate these technologies well. Some people are able to do that for the purposes of their businesses or for their own personal reputations or follower counts. A lot of people aren't. And I think it creates a lot of social angst to not have the opportunity to kind of run through these roles. It's something I'd never considered before you start talking about Rotary, but like even in our family meetings when we were little, when the kids were little, my kids are teenagers now, we would actually rotate the role of facilitator of the family meeting. And even our 8-year-old, we had an established way of doing it, could facilitate a meeting because it has the same steps every time.
Ding, ding, ding,
Right.
like yeah, or like going to, like, a Passover dinner, it's
Yes,
like
yes.
turns reading the Haggadah, and you can actually make one online with, like, the tools, and it's funny. But, I think a really good technology should not be considered based on, is it new? Because I think new technology is good until you find out the issues in it, that if you do it too fast up front and it gets too well adopted, it doesn't mean that it's good, it just means that it's popular. But I think a good technology works when people can use it when they're tired, they're hungry, they're not focused, or they're angry. So that piece of paper that you got to sign with your kid is very different than having to have a connection or a phone and having the JavaScript rendering the browser. Also, nobody needs to be an expert or go to Stanford and get a degree in the computer science or be good at JavaScript or update the site. You don't need one of those people in order to send out that paper. It's a PDF. Like it's pretty straightforard.
I
And
mean,
you
information
figure
that
it
broke
out.
through was just photos of the website that somebody had screen grabbed with their phone. I just loved it.
For me, that's a good organization.
It was
And
great, yeah.
yeah, and also the people that say, "Oh, I don't have patience to fill out a piece of paper," but would do it on an online form, like, there's already it's an interesting thing, right? And so the other thing is having pieces of paper in your life, yeah, like, they take up physical space. It's harder to forget them, and it's like when big movies are planned, you don't just have a Pinterest board and share it back and forth. You get a room together, you print everything out, or you draw everything, you put it on the wall, and you physically, like with old with, like, how magazines should be done and all the movies, like Devil Wears Prada, the layouts are done physically so you can see. And those books are, printed out, and people would make fun of executives for printing out their emails, but when you print something out, you are able to focus a lot better because it's not a transmissive light screen. There's also studies about if you walk in a park, then you're going to come back more focused because you saw fractals and there's less CO2 outside. It's getting your brain out of, if you're on a Zoom call all day, they did like a scan of the brain, and it just never, it's almost like you need a screensaver to get out of that state. And if all the interfaces are the same, but in real life they aren't, then how do we think? Because our brain starts to ignore and forget things that are the same thing again and again, which oddly in a meeting, even though the structure is the same thing again and again, the structure is okay, the content can be different. And so there's like some imagination that goes through that. So I think it's the hardest thing for me has been seeing people who are like, I'm a scholar of governance, and they don't look into the history of any institutions that have been around for more than 10 years, or they wanna make something new and fresh, but it's all the same stuff. And so that's, what I said in the beginning about finding tech that is classic. Most of tech is really the same. If it's digital, it's like you have a database, you're writing to it, you're reading it, you are merging it, you're deleting it, you're sharding it so that it can be served, you're querying it, you're sorting it. I mean, that's all it really is. And then the views on that are different. But if it's analog, it can last for so long that wait, what is saving more time actually? Like I never do the inbox zero thing. Because if I did, people would expect that I answered a bunch of, like, emails that weren't necessary. If people need to get in touch with me, they can call me on the phone. And if people are afraid to call me on the phone, it takes longer to schedule an hour call than to be on the phone for 5 minutes and be like, done. We have this idea that we have to stay on this thing because it's on a screen, but I've forgotten so many of the speeches that I've given remotely because I wasn't there. And there's this great story by E.M. Forrester called "The Machine Stops." I think it's written in 1927 or something, which is talking about a whole society that works via screens and does remote work, and then the machine stops one day and they have to go out. Ah, traveling is so annoying. But I think there are different ways to think about things, and I think the future doesn't really come from the front, it comes from the side. And just like getting sideswiped by a car in your blind spot, if we don't have metacognition and zoom out and consider time as more than just like the last 5 years, even though we listen to music from lots of different eras and read books and we don't care what era they're from, they're classics. We don't think the same as technology. And in civil engineering class, you always learn about the catastrophe of the Galloping Gertie Bridge in 1940 and the Tacoma Narrows, that
Mhm.
crashed, left a lot of cars in the river, because that was the idea, is that you have a requirement to, you have a responsibility in engineering, actual engineering, not software engineering, to make sure that a product, let's say a bridge, works under bad conditions.
Mhm.
How many pieces of software work under terrible conditions? And
Mm.
so, one of the points we get for Calm Tech is if there's a terrible condition, it still works. And because if we're going to be left with a bunch of junk that was on an impossible to redo supply chain, let's say something bad happens, we won't be able to service things. And that's why there were so many like, slug bugs, slug bug yellows in Cuba, and in a bunch of different countries you have, old audio equipment, which would be considered outdated, but it's not. It's 70s. Everything was very legible. So I think in a sense, this whole digital flat screen era is actually a step back in time. And I want this era to be over and to be laughed at as soon as possible.
Like the avocado fridge color from the '60s, just like we
That's
don't
beautiful.
like, just let go of it. In the
Well,
past, we no longer order. I mean, I'm with you. I feel like, it's part of what you're describing here, and it kind of I'll make a connection, a generational connection that's kind of coming to me. My daughter Georgia, who is 15, says all the time that she's overstimulated. I don't think she really understands that it's we're talking about physical stimulation. There is an element of the physical stimulation, but I think kids today are not they've never lived in a simpler situation. And I remember the advice from my grandfather, especially when he was reading my essays for school, was the classic keep it simple, stupid. I don't know if you remember that KISS methodology, right? You wanna really keep it as simple as possible, which seems, very much to but I think, I'm kinda curious, like, how do we if we were to eventually look at this era as ludicrous, I think we would need people to feel more irritated by their environment. Why are people so willing to tolerate an environment that affects their attention so negatively, that is so exhausting and overwhelming? Like, why do you think we're tolerating that at the level that we are when the solutions seem so simple once we discuss them?
Well, I think cell phones are kind of the new cigarettes. If you don't have something to do, you can just pick it up.
Mhm.
Once you're in it, it wrecks your emotions. And so I actually don't think we are overstimulated. I think we're understimulated.
Yeah, say more.
I think it's about how we build our buildings and what we have. There's all this, millennial beige gray. We have printed floors instead of real hardwood floors. Like our environments are not walking distance. We're not connected to our neighbors or our neighborhoods. And so we want connection because we're humans, we're social, and we need stories. And when there's this device in our pocket that gives us stories, which we drastically crave because we're storytelling creatures that use tools. We like to have stuff in our hands. We like stories and we want to be connected. Ding, ding, ding. And so I think it has to do with how our architecture has declined in terms of surface area. All of the, you look at the Macaulay Culkin house from that movie A Christmas Story. No,
Home Alone.
thank you. Cut that a little bit. But yeah, the movie Home Alone, you have the house from Home Alone that had all this wallpaper and, like, beautiful wood, and it looked like a wealthy person's house, and now it's just, like, looks like every other cookie cutter house because, I don't know, private equity companies have taken over, flip and ditch and all these things. But when the environment is understimulating, we want to go into our phones. Like, I've been able to track this, I'll go fly fishing and I won't need to look at my phone. I'll go out and I'll say, "Oh, life happens a lot more slowly out here. I can see time." Or look at these rocks from like a million years ago. And so it's a lot of if you go on a walk, you're much less likely to want to use your phone. And the time in which you really want to use your phone, you should be going on a walk. But a lot of people can't walk because their neighborhoods are really loud and noisy. There's nothing to walk to. It's dangerous. You don't have natural light. You have a really, really low resolution LED lights that don't render the colors in your house appropriately. It loses all the reds, so you actually kind of look like a ghost in your own home. And under those lights, especially in poorer communities, you're not actually getting the full spectrum of life. And so when you look at your phone, it looks like it's filling in that spectrum that you're
Mm,
missing in terms of touch, in terms of light. So I think a lot of it is urban planning, architecture, that has declined in terms of decoration, since like the Victorian times. And if you go to any original community, they're going to have tons and tons of texture and time and culture and things like that. And
mm,
then it's, what would you normally do in your community? We're not really organized around communities. And so it's very hard to, we know that the phone is annoying and it feels bad, just like cigarettes. It doesn't feel good to smoke, but ooh, it's so shiny and bright. And we don't have a lot other things to do. So it really stimulates our mind to get into that like mental space around all these cool ideas and then we don't do them. So it seems like an easy solution. I really like this book by a person who used to live in Portland. It's called what's it called? It's like Yes or No, What's Worth Doing?
mhm,
Hell Yes or No, What's Worth Doing? By the founder of CD Baby. Now, I like this book because it was like, is it a hell yes or hell no? You don't have to do it. And there's so many people that, they come back from vacation, they're like, "Oh, actually, I didn't need to do all these things. I
mm,
don't need to do like, what's actually worth it?" And sometimes it's like you go on a road trip, you're an hour out of town or 3 hours at a time, and you remember what you care about, or you see a really amazing movie and you remember what you care about suddenly. Those are really the only things. All this little tiny work actually takes up more time. And so it's about, you don't have a wood shop in your garage anymore, but it's like woodworking, needlepoint,
Mm.
all these things that people had to do or got to do are apprenticeships too. Like, being able to learn from an elder or having, like, a home ec class, which I wish I could have taken as a kid, or I got to take wood shop, which was cool. You have to be present or you will die. Your hand will get cut off. You can't be focusing your attention elsewhere. And so you get this respect of a tool. Even in Japan, a 3-year-old can walk down the street and go shopping for their parents for, like, they start to do errands at that age.
Mm.
Um, so the idea that we're almost, like, super infantilized for a really long time, and then we're, like, kept in these pacifiers because we aren't trusted to do things or we don't even have that full spectrum of life, that understimulation is obnoxious because all of us know that there's something more. All of us know that we could be more alive, but we don't get to have it, and we don't get to experience it, and a lot of us never got to experience it before, so we're trying to make up for something that we never even knew existed.
Yeah, it strikes me that maybe sometimes when we're feeling overstimulated, there's a we're addressing like an intolerance to this kind of periodic boredom that is kind of a necessary gap before we can actually come back to our own attention, right? There's this sort of unplugging that happens. We have parts of the day that kind of there are unplugging times, but it can be really, really hard to not do it. It's similar, there's similar to smoking, right? Like it's like they're almost or eating. There's like certain time periods where we think, okay, I'm unplugging from the machine. I'm not looking, but almost every other moment we're sort of plugged in. For me, it's really around like the audio. I I've really done a lot to not look at my phone as much anymore, but I'm still stimulating myself through audio, through podcasts and listening to things, even when I walk around in nature. How does that fit into this calm tech kind of concept? Stimulating your brain with thoughts or reasoning or exploration?
I think it's still
Well,
I think it's still totally reasonable. I listen to podcasts and long audiobooks when I'm in non-places.
yeah,
Marc Auger talked about non-places being a space where you don't have any relation, identity, or history, like a traffic jam, an airport. And in those places, yeah,
yeah,
like, you having an audiobook gives you a place. So,
yeah.
like, I was reading The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which took me, like, a whole month. It's like a 1,000-page book about Robert Moses and his development of the modern highway system. It's an incredibly well-written book. I wanted more of it, but because I was listening to it in a lot of places where I might feel alone while I was traveling, I felt like there was this nice person hanging out with me, telling me a story. And it was a long story and full of micro stories, and I was able to enjoy. Now, if I'm outside, I think if it's an actual outside place, it's really good to listen to nature because there's fractal sounds and there's fractal images, and those are all really good at restoring your mental state into something that's a little bit happier and more, like, self-balancing. But if you're walking down the street in a busy city, everything is discordant, everything's super loud, everything's crazy, all the bright and light, listen to something, and the person who developed, like, the first Walkman, he was, like, 12 or 14 years old, Steve Mann, he's talking about how he didn't wanna listen to other people's information, he wanted to listen to his own, and so he, made this wearable computer, that's, kind of a Walkman. It's not what became the Walkman, but it was, like, his pet project, and he then put on a heads-up display to take all of the images on the billboards and reduce them into a flat panel so he could read his own work. It was he didn't like augmented reality, he liked diminished reality, and I think in a sense, headphones are a calm technology in that you can diminish a sharp reality and tune it to something a little bit easier for you. Everything is very loud, especially in the United States, and so I wear earplugs and then I put headphones on that are noise canceling, and then I turn the volume up so that I can be in this pocket. And then, just the clothes that you wear, if everything is like this undifferentiated polyester, you're not actually feeling a material. Something with materiality is really nice. I know a lot of people wear jewelry so that they can kinda touch it, you can see it. Some
Mhm.
people press through fingernails, weird plastic stuff, but those are the touch points in which people are allowed to be creative. You can kind of see with, like, a lot of traditional men's fashion, you have these beautiful Oxfords made of leather that change over time, that you don't need to get a ton of, that you grow into, that you become familiar with, and so over time, everything becomes familiar to you, and you're carried around in something that's an extension of yourself. It's very different from having something that's fashionable for a season and tossing it away from Shein or whatever. So these things of we get very low impulse control when our brains are cognitively mashed up and, like, destabilized so that we're more open to purchasing something. But if we can hold on to the idea of metacognition and how are we thinking what we're thinking? What are we thinking? Are those thoughts our own or are they mediated by something else? It's a new form of clarity that is the new form of people getting used to walking down the main street with the plate glass windows and not immediately having to buy everything as they walk down or feeling bad. Now,
Mm,
most people still don't have that, right? That's like a whole thing. There's Vicki Robbins' Your Money or Your Life, which is a really good book, the whole, hell yes or hell no. Like these are there are little books that are metacognitive framings around understanding what's important. Like no one really cares if you have the lip filler or not, but if you do have it, you're more likely to be in a group where lip filler is the thing that people care about. And I try to think on a longer period of time, where do I wanna put my it sounds silly, where do I wanna put my archives? What Easter eggs do I wanna leave behind to the next generation of weirdos that find my archive in some library that is willing
mhm.
to accept it, you
Well,
know?
it
It's
feels like it expands even, if you were to think about your tribe not as like the specific people who are following you on the apps or friends with you mediated through your device, but I would imagine, Case, that you think about the relationships you would have across time and who are the people, the thinkers, and that you have affinity with, and that gives you a sense of place that is very different, I think, than one that might be through these kind of social media experiences. I
Yeah.
I know we're kind of getting at ti this has been such a fascinating conversation, and I appreciate all of the different rabbit holes that we've gone down. This is such an expansive topic. So I would love to just kind of close with, if somebody's kind of new to this concept, I first of all, I can recommend your book because I found it on Libby, which I feel like is great. So you can get it from your local library. I've read it on my Kindle, which I feel like is a pretty calm device. And I really enjoyed it. It broke down some of these concepts for me in a really understandable way. Still really relevant, written in 2015 and endures, in my opinion.
Yeah.
um, but what else could you recommend to people if they want to kind of explore a little bit more about calm technology and you? How can they get in touch with this work after this part
Sure.
today?
So there's a website called calmtech.institute, which has some information. There's an old set of articles and papers that aren't old, they're contemporary from 1990 on calmtech.com. That's the archive that we also run. And I would say, as if you want to Google search, like there's a talk I gave at Remarkable Headquarters called Texture and What the Mind Needs. It's probably what I would consider a good talk. I hold myself to a pretty high standard, but I think I'm getting to be a decent speaker, and I've got maybe 20 more years to become a really good speaker compared to what I'd like to come across, right? But the other thing is, I know that we can't quit this until we do a little tidbit about AI, and I'll just say this. When you're reading someone's archive from the past, the words that they use and writing is one of the best ways to archive yourself into the future. If you want to, you know, if you want youth, just write and write into the future because everyone that I can read Upton Sinclair when he was 25, and I'm reading 25, but he's not 25 anymore. He's passed. So it's a way to archive a sense of consciousness around what you're doing, and it's incredibly hard to do. And when you use a great big word averager machine like an LLM to process someone's writing or to process your own thoughts, you rob your brain of the work that makes it part of you. And, somebody was seeing this meme, they're like, "I can't believe people aren't using AI in schools to, like, do everything." And the response was like, "Yeah, in gym class, people are running around a gym covering lengths that an Uber could just do in 30 seconds.
Hmm.
It is not that, it's a physical fitness type of thing. You can choose what you want to do as, alongside technology, just like a tool. But if you start to rely on it for everything and you lose your voice in the process, there's nothing for anybody to read of you. You flatten yourself. And so I would like personally to be uncompressible. And I like to have friends that are also uncompressible. And our friendships are in person and on the phone, which is hilarious because a phone is a vocal compression algorithm that works really well from Bell Labs. But it's important to think about what matters in all time. We'll still have clocks and seeds and agriculture and things like that. And, what books do you really care about? And to get that time is very rare, to really be there. And, meditation is really fun for that, in that you're not trying to sit there and go, you're watching your thoughts come into your brain and you're watching them pass through. You're not sinking into them. And I think it's the same with social media. Can you watch what's going on and not let your brain sink into it, not let it tease you, and look for the one that's looking? And if you can, interesting things happen. And so, wow, it's an interesting time and it seems like it's going really fast, but there are all sorts of things that exist without needing to be updated. And those are, in my opinion, the truths. And we can always jump into those systems at any time
Yeah. There are all these things that are not, is that we said not waiting to be updated,
that
right?
don't need to be updated.
Don't need to be updated. That's a wonderful kind of, I think, ending sentence to be, and that we have a privilege to use now because they work just fine, like a
Yeah,
cheap,
what doesn't need to be updated?
right? Exactly. This journal that's next to me where I handwrite things is not accessible by AI. So, uh,
And
what?
even if it was, it it doesn't stimulate your brain reading it on the screen in the same way that it does when you touch it on paper.
Yeah.
And you can touch that on paper and an archive in the future, and what that does is stimulates your brain in an interesting thing. So what will happen in the future is very interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Case, for this conversation and for teaching us today. I've really appreciated it. And I hope to learn more from you as your career unfolds.
Yeah, thank you for recording this. Dun, 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 dun.
Okay, I'd love to thank you for listening to our guest today. As a reminder, this spring, the People and Culture team at Tao has taken over the pod. We're exploring the human side of the massive tech shifts happening right now. And each week, we're talking to a different Portland leader about what they're seeing in their work and personal lives, and what that means for the rest of us as we navigate rapid change. I'm your host, Kate Cockrell, leadership coach, trainer, and co-founder at Skill Charter. If this conversation sparked something for you, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just send me a DM. And if you have a story, perspective, or question you think we should share or explore, just reach out. We're building this in real time, and your feedback will help us shape what comes next.